various methods to bypass defensive solutions. Okay. User mode hooks are a critical pillar in many endpoint solutions. It is only natural for attackers to develop various methods to bypass them. Omri Misgav from Ensilo will cover the fundamental concepts of hooking, dissect malware samples found in the wild that bypass user mode hooks, and will demonstrate why their techniques are so effective. I would like to invite Omri Misgav.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. So today we're going to talk about how malware in the wild are bypassing security protections using that are based upon user mode hooks. My name is Omri, as I was presented. I'm currently the security research team leader at Ensilo. We are endpoint security startup. Today with me was supposed to be Udi, our CTO, but he's a bit under the weather, so I'll wish him best of health. We're going to discuss a bit of some background, some introduction to the subject. We're going to go over about 6 different techniques and 6 different malware samples, malware families that are using each one. And then we're going to talk about what we can do in order to adjust while we're conducting our research, and some takeaways. The talk will be centered around Windows operating system, and there will be some assembly code. If you're not really fluent in assembly, it's okay. I'll try to walk you through it. It's not that much. So hooking is basically the ability to take a function and be able to change it and how it behaves. For instance, we can decide that we want to log every call to a certain function or just block the usage of such function. User mode hooks are being used in many security products nowadays, not just endpoint, and in some analysis tools. And except from the different security products, it's also used by certain profilers for performance monitoring and application virtualization. And of course, also malware uses these techniques. Why actually use this kind of samples, this kind of hooking mechanisms? So basically, once we're using hooks in user mode, writing code in user mode, it's much more easier than actually writing code in the kernel. It's considered to be more stable. It won't cause blue screens if something goes wrong, but it still has its problems. You can check out our previous research from a couple of years ago that we presented in Black Hat. The main reason to use user mode hooks is because nowadays the kernel is protected. You can't really hook whatever you like there. You can only integrate in certain areas that the operating system allows you. And that kind of protection does not exist in user mode. And the last reason is that you get the full context. For instance, if you have a web browser that is using an SSL connection, the information will only be available on the application layer. For instance, if you want to check to get access to the URL or actual data that goes on the wire, you can only do that from the application layer. All the bypasses that we're going to show, they are not really new. They have been around for quite a while now. But in the last year and a half, 2 years, we see an increasing amount of them being actually used by malware. And we also see that more pen testers are paying more attention to this kind of protections. So a bit of a hooking background. So we can see the different examples of flows of an API calls. What we can understand from these graphs is that there are many different places that we can place our hook in order to be able to achieve our goal, that is controlling the specific API, specific function that we want to be able to monitor. And so if we put it in the wrong place, it will be really easy to bypass. And how it's actually done, besides of IAT hooking, which I won't get into today, usually inline hooks are being used. They're also called detours for some of you that are familiar with. And this kind of hooking is done in a couple of ways. The first one is by actually controlling changing the control flow with the appropriate instructions. You can see that in the upper example, basically we took a function, we replaced the first instructions with a jump instruction to our hook, and then we go back to our function. And the other way around to get around is by generating exceptions. This is something that is usually used by debuggers. If you place a breakpoint, it generates an exception. You can also try and use invalid instructions, which is sometimes done by malware. And for the actual techniques, we categorize them in 3 different groups. The first one is basically just loading a second instance of the DLL that we want to be able to use. So the first technique is manually loading the DLL from disk. Basically read the file, use reflective loading, which is a very common malware technique for running its code. That's mainly online, available source code online. We can see that the Formbook, which is quite a notorious info stealer, it uses this technique. It loads another instance of anti-DLL, and uses it in order to perform its code injection and process soloing. It has a pretty elaborate code injection process. And also when it gets to accessing the file system or registry, it uses the secondary DLL. We can see how it looks in memory. If we open up the debugger while we analyze the sample, the upper picture is the regular anti-DLL. We can see that the debugger loaded up the symbols and everything. We can see the anti-close function, API function. And if we look at the lower picture, we can see the result of the Formbook bypass. It's essentially the same code. So we need to understand how it's going to look from our perspective and how we can detect it. If we do that, then let's say the dynamic analysis, so during runtime, we can see that in the call stack, we won't have anti-DLL before the transition to the kernel. We'll have something else. If we look for forensic artifacts, we could see, for instance, in a memory dump, we can see that there is a floating PE in memory, same size and everything, but its attributes are different. Instead of a section, a memory image, we'll have private memory allocated. And the next technique is cloning the DLL that we want to use. Ensilo used it. It's a downloader. Basically, it copies kernel 32 DLL and uses the create process function during its process soloing execution. What's interesting to see that the process soloing was observed, using process soloing from about 2016, but only the last year they decided to add the hook bypass. It's only being done once the malware detects that the original function is being hooked. If you can see in the disassembly on the left, it checks the first byte in the function, and in case it's already hooked, it assumes it's by a security product, and then it creates a copy of kernel 32 and loads it up with the function load library. And again, if we'll do the same analysis, the same steps what we usually do when we research malware, we can see that the call stack will have a different DLL in it. We can see that the is in the kernel are dropped. And if we'll do the forensics analysis, the forensic artifacts, we can see that there is virtually 2 exact modules loaded. We can compare it by size, headers, section information, and such. And the last technique in this group of bypasses is the section remapping. It's essentially mapping the same section, but using the lower level APIs and only the kernel part of the image loader. Osiris used this technique. It's a banking Trojan. It's a newer version of Kronos, for those of you who are familiar with it. It's interesting to see here that they used to use a different technique that we're going to cover just briefly. Okay. And if we do the same analysis again, we can see that now anti-DLL is found in a different location, even though the symbols match in the call stack. You can see that there are multiple load events during runtime for the same DLL. And if we look at the bottom picture, we can see that the original DLL will have an entry in the PEB, loaded module list, but the remapped section won't. So the next group of techniques, it's basically a direct invocation of system calls, using the system services directly, without needing to go through the normal the regular OS DLLs. So the first basic technique here is by parsing anti-DLL, and then using the opcodes for system calls directly. Dargate is a crypto miner and stealer that uses this technique. It's written in Delphi, and it copy-pasted the technique from a source code that is available online from about 6 years ago, and uses it for its process soloing and writing to the registry for its UAC bypass attempt. If we look at the call stack, again, we try to do our incident response or malware research, we see that anti-DLL is nowhere to be found. If we try and look for forensic artifacts, we won't really find them. We can try and find the system call opcodes outside of anti-DLL, but it's not something that is quite straightforward. And just to get a clear picture, on the red, you can see that marked in red is the places that the bypass technique will actually be able to bypass, where the hooks are being placed. and the green is where the hooks, if we place, and the green if we place the hooks there, they'll still be intact. We can see that on a 64-bit machine, we have the emulation layer for 32-bit applications, and hooks there will still go through. And that's exactly why we have a new technique, another technique in this group, which is using Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate is pretty much the ability to go into the emulation layer without going through the system DLLs. It's something that is known for quite a lot of time. It's not really actually related to user mode hooks bypassing at all. The reason for that, that this technique really works, is that vendors didn't migrate their 32-bit hooking engine to the 64-bit layer, and they pretty much decided to keep what they had. What's interesting to note here is that debuggers are quite blind to this area. We have the globe imposter malware that uses this technique for its process following attempt. If we'll take a look a bit about the code, we can see that during runtime, the system calls, the call stacks will be quite different. If you look at the bottom, we'll see a regular system call for a 32-bit application that it goes through the emulation layer, and we'll see the system DLLs for the WoW64 subsystem. If we look at the upper layer, we can see that for the same system call, this call stack looks very strange, and we can't find the system DLLs there. If we'll try and do forensics analysis, we'll have the same issue of trying and finding the relevant opcodes for this transition between the 32-bit and 64-bit layers. And it's not a very strong forensic indicator for us. And we can see how we progressed, and that right now, even our hook in the lower level emulation layer is being bypassed. So it's really easy to go around this kind of hooks. And for the last group and last technique we're going to cover, we're going to talk about code splicing, which is basically just a very fancy name for byte stealing. It basically means that we're going to copy the first instructions of the target function and move them to a different location, and then we're going to execute the start of the function from that location and go over to the original function past the instruction that we already copied. It's pretty much the anti-hook scenario. We can see that the code fork used this kind of technique for their downloader component. Surprisingly enough, their dropper for the downloader didn't use this at all, even though it does malicious activity such as process following. If we'll try and pretty much see how it looks in memory, we can see, if we'll take a look at the lower parts of the images, we can see the original functions, the original instructions from the functions in comparison to the jump locations that the malware copied. And if we'll try and take a look at the call stack during runtime, nothing will actually be different for us. It will be practically the same. You can see kernel 32 and anti-DLL called from the unpacked code. That's pretty much it. So if we'll put all of those kind of techniques together and next to each other in order to understand their differences, we have the forensic indicators that we talked about and the artifacts. And if we'll, for a minute, we'll discuss a bit about their drawbacks and why each one is being used. So the first technique is really different from what normally happens on the OS. So they decided, so over time, we can see that other techniques are stand out less. For when you clone a DLL, you make changes to the file system, which, as every malware researcher, you should know, it's quite visible. And because it's usually for system DLLs, it's something that it's easily monitored, and some products actually do look at it, and they can identify it. Because it uses the regular OS loader, lower level or functions or dependencies can still be hooked. Next, for the section remapping, it has a bit of an issue because it's only used a partial part of the loader. It can't be used for complex code since it doesn't handle relocation or initializations. So you don't get a lot of functionality from it. Anti-DLL parsing and Evans Gate allow for obvious reasons for very limited functionality, only the system calls themselves. And finally, for code splicing, again, lower levels or dependencies can be hooked, so we can't avoid detection by those layers. So just to sum everything up for a second, these techniques are used by all sorts of malware families. These are not necessarily sophisticated actors, and they are not nation states. So you can see that all kinds of people, all kinds of attackers can use these actual techniques. They usually use it only in the start of their execution, just for the first steps. Once they get through their initial, let's say, foothold, they kind of forget about everything, and from there they don't really care about bypassing the hooks anymore. Some techniques are not as commonly used in the wild, and if you're interested, you can see them later on and see them and get some more information on your own. And okay, so basically, after we covered all of these things, and I said a lot of stuff on how can we detect it, and how can we notice that hooks are being bypassed. So during our analysis, we need to put some extra attention into looking at events that are related to system DLLs. Multiple reads or loads or even copies, it's not something that usually happens and can indicate for a hook bypass attempt. Check the call stacks. I don't know a lot of researchers that actually do it and look at the call stacks. There's plenty of information that we need to handle while we're doing the actual work, and that's just another piece of it, and it can be quite complex to understand and sort through the entire information. Once we do, if you do decide to use hooks or breakpoints, then try to spice things up. Don't keep them in the same positions. Try not to put them on the start of the function. Try to change the location each time and randomize it. Try to hook various locations, various different places during the execution path, so you can be able to correlate the data between one hook and another and see if something slipped by or came from a different location that you weren't aware of. And try and correlate it with kernel data. And for instance, you can try and use OS provided information, such as ETW. Even though it's still version dependent, it's been extended over time, so the coverage grows and becomes more full. And some final words. We only saw a handful of examples. I think that in the last week, I saw 4 different variants of hooks that we got through them while doing our day-to-day work. these are very easy to use. It's quite trivial. Many of those have source code available online, so it's not hard to get them and actually use them. There are not a lot of innovations, but they are still very effective. Evidently, otherwise it won't be still used. MITRE attack framework, for those of you who are familiar with, doesn't actually reference this kind of bypass as a defense evasion, even though it does consider hooks as a malicious technique in various scenarios for, let's say, privilege escalation or credential access. And if you are using hooks, user mode hooks for security, you should know that it's not enough. Any questions? No. Thank you.